So if you guys remember, I had a Phyllodium pulchellum. It's sometimes referred to as a SOMA plant by some in the botanical online community, but I abandoned the plant completely since I experimented with it and I did a few extractions as well, and they were almost completely inactive. But recently someone on Instagram, they PM'd me from Japan, and he just shared his experience and that it was active as well for him, but it was extremely weak. And based on the images that he shared with me, I'd estimate that he used maybe 80 to 100 grams for his tea. And he still had a fairly weak experience with the Phyllodium. On the Nexus, recently someone has brought up the interest in this plant again, and they recently shared a paper with some of the yields that a Chinese researcher team got from the from the root material. And he erroneously thought that the yield was around 3.3%, but if you looked closer at the paper, the yield had to the power of 1. So instead of 3%, it's actually 0.03%, which does seem more realistic to more recent attempts at extractions and the actual activity of the plant itself. So in general, I like to research and read the original publications and references in many of the papers and the ideas that we have. So I decided to take a look at Trout's notes on this plant. He has a series of publications on ayahuasca and cacti and different species of interests. And in this reference, he puts the plant as yielding 0.2%, which seems pretty low, but considering how rare the 5 MAOI is in the plant kingdom, that is a shockingly high amount. And for over 20 years, no one really questioned that. It wasn't really explored much until Julian Palmer, according to the lore in the paper in the video that he published, he took it onto himself to explore some of these lesser known plants. And it is a great task to actually do that, since you have to travel there and actually find the plant and things. And it's not as easy as many would think. But he used this specific reference for his dosage and as a reference or like a proof to his idea that this plant is the SOMA plant. And in actuality, it was maybe a typographical error or a calculation error, but rather than 0.2% yield, in actuality it's closer to 0.02 or even much lower, depending on how the reference was actually calculated. If it's 0.2% of the 0.3% total alkaloids, the actual total yield would be closer to 0.0006%, which is exactly the yield that I got in my personal extraction experiment. But ignoring the first reference with that high 0.2% yield of 5 MAOI, I took a look at the actual references in the paper, and the publisher, if you look at the references in his paper, he does provide the exact same numbers as Trout publishes under the mature plant root references. But if you look at the calculations underneath, he actually provides the raw data, and even there you can calculate without seeing the original reference paper. You can actually calculate that he's off by 1 decimal point with, let's say, a yield of 790 milligrams of an alkaloid from 1.8 kilograms. He either had a typo or just a calculation error, and he was off by a factor of 10. And that plays a huge difference in the terms of the yield and the activity of this plant. So, like I mentioned, Julian used that 0.2% yield as the reference point for his dosing of his fresh material. But considering that he was off by a factor of 10, even if he used the entire fresh material that he had, he would likely have a very limited experience. And based on his publications, he even used a much lower amount, where he started with 200 grams and he only used 80 grams since he assumed that it was 0.2% yield. And the experience itself doesn't even come into comparison to what he published as his experience. I am aware that everyone has a different tolerance and a different experience in itself, but I think that the lore and the setting that he that he physically took it upon himself to travel across the world to a few countries, and he found a plant and did it himself. I think that contributed to his, I want to say, slight exaggeration to his experience. There have been many psychonauts and personal researchers that have tested this plant themselves and have come nowhere near the experience that Julian reported himself. And now, 20 years later, I found this simple typographical error that Trout did in his reference book, and it just kind of brings to light that you should always check your references and don't take everything at someone's given status or whatever. With all of my examples and experiments, I share how I did it, and you guys should replicate and test it for yourselves. I'm not an authority figure, and even if I were, I can always make mistakes. And I don't know, it's kind of upsetting that someone would just completely mislead the audience to such a massive degree. With this plant in specific, it's not a massive issue since it's not particularly expensive to get seeds, but it does take quite a bit of time and effort to get the seeds and then to grow them And I don't know, it was pretty upsetting. And then some people may bring into the issue that there's an MAOI in this, but considering the fractional error of a decimal, so factor of 10, on basically all of the compounds reported in Trout's notes, there is an extremely, extremely minute amount of the MAOI. And the activity of it actually influencing the activity of the plant is extremely minimal and highly unlikely. And more recently, there's a lot of other papers that published the results and the reactions of certain cancer cells and things like that with different fractions of this plant specifically. And in the Chinese papers, they have an even lower value to the original publications, even lower than what I actually got myself. And this seems more in reality, more in line with reality than what we've been told over the past maybe 5 years, even more. Yeah, around 7 years now that Julian published his video on his experience. And I've personally tested this myself, and so have others. There is indeed something active in this plant, and based on the publications, it is indeed 5-MeO and DMT and a few others. But the extent that the potency and I guess the lore of this plant was exaggerated so much that it just pales like to what it is in reality, with you needing, like by my rough estimate, around 250 grams of fresh material just for a single experience, if that. It's pretty daunting to have that much material for an experience that someone mentioned would be a fifth or less of that material needed. Trout, I emailed him, and it was probably just a typographical error or calculation error. I'm not sure if he'll get around to correcting it or not, since, again, this reference material is 20 years old now. And with Julian, I'm not sure if it was intentional or if he actually had that experience or not. It is completely possible that, like, psychologically he did build it up quite a bit with the lore, and I think he got the money as an inheritance or something. So there is like a separate factor to it, and the setting, he was there physically in the native country, he's exploring a basically unknown plant. So I'm not gonna call him an outright liar, but the experience has been exaggerated, and his reference material that he used to collaborate his story is just wrong in general. So yeah, this is what I was doing for the past day since it came up again. I was just researching the original papers that were referenced in Trout's notes, and I just came upon that error that for the past 20 years nobody really noticed or questioned, and has caused quite a bit of people to waste their time basically growing a plant that requires quite a lot of space. So yeah, going on, there was also another reference to one of his books. There was a specific cactus, I believe, that he also misplaced the point, the decimal point. But in that other case, it wasn't a calculation error. It was just that I'm assuming the reference paper had a poor quality to it, since the one that I received originally was also poor, and you can't quite make out where the point is. But I was able to find a different reference paper to a clear publication, and the decimal point was off by the same factor of 0.1. So yeah, just sharing. Don't just accept everything blindly, even if something is considered basically true. Doesn't mean it's not wrong. We can always verify something ourselves, and you should, if you have enough time, experiment on your own regardless. Always be safe. In this case, it was a factor to the weaker side, so instead of 0.1, it's 0.01. So as far as harm reduction, that isn't a huge issue. But if it was the other way around, if I reference something as 0.01 and it's 0.1, that decimal point would make something 10 times more potent and possibly cause harm to that individual that decides to use my reference. So always be careful. It's best to know exactly what you're consuming. If you don't know what it is, either get it tested using a reagent kit or something, or start at extremely low volumes, like with an unknown plant. Even known plants may produce toxins, so always be careful. And mixing things with MAOIs can be very dangerous, so always take heed when you experiment yourself. While on the topic of MAOIs, in the past, the decab or chaliponga was considered to be a 5 MAOI containing plant as well, but other researchers in DMT Nexus, they've experimented doing actual analysis on the plant material, and they only found a higher concentration of the DMT and little to only trace amounts of 5 MAOI. Originally, the stronger effect was believed to be the 5 MAOI, but it was actually just possibly just the higher content found in the plant.